The moment she said, "Daddy," the entire room forgot how to breathe. It was supposed to be the most controlled night of the year at the Carter Industries Annual Awards Gala, a celebration of power, legacy, and billion-dollar success, where every detail was curated under white chandeliers and soft golden light. Ethan Carter stood at the center of it all, America's rising tech empire CEO, composed in a tailored black tuxedo, his presence so calm it felt untouchable as cameras quietly tracked his every movement. Around him, executives, investors, and media figures filled the grand ballroom of the Manhattan Sky Hall, where glass walls reflected the city skyline like a crown of steel and light. Applause rose and fell in waves as his name was announced for the night's highest recognition, but Ethan barely reacted, offering only a measured nod as if success had long stopped surprising him. Somewhere beyond the velvet rope, a small figure stood still near the edge of the crowd. No one noticed her at first, not the security, not the guests, not even the staff weaving through champagne trays and polished marble floors. But Claire Donovan did. She had arrived late, slipping into the far side of the hall dressed modestly, her expression carefully controlled, though her eyes scanned the room with attention she could not fully hide. And then she saw the child. A little girl, no older than 6, standing alone with a quiet certainty that did not belong in a place like this. Emily's gaze never wavered as she looked past the sea of adults and fixed directly on the stage. Claire's breath caught instantly, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse as recognition hit her like a silent shockwave she had spent years trying to avoid. Emily took one step forward, then another, small shoes tapping softly against polished stone, weaving through legs and tables as if drawn by something invisible and undeniable. Ethan was still speaking on stage when he noticed the shift, the subtle disturbance in the crowd, the way conversations began to fracture into whispers. Security guards turned their heads. Cameras adjusted focus. A ripple of confusion spread across the ballroom like wind, through still water. And then Emily stopped directly in front of the stage. The music had already faded without anyone realizing it, as if the entire room was waiting for something it did not yet understand. Ethan's eyes lowered, finally locking onto her, and for the first time that night, his expression changed. Not fear, not anger, but something far more destabilizing. Recognition without explanation. Emily tilted her head slightly upward, her voice small but steady, carrying through the silence like it had been rehearsed by fate itself. "Daddy." The word landed harder than any announcement, cutting through the gala like a blade of disbelief. A collective inhale swept the room, followed by absolute stillness. Ethan did not move. Claire stepped forward instinctively but stopped herself halfway, trapped between truth and consequence. The world beyond the glass walls of the ballroom seemed to disappear as all attention collapsed into a single point: a child, a CEO, and a word that should not have been spoken in a room this perfect. Then, from somewhere beyond the stage lights, a staff member quickly approached with a sealed document envelope marked with corporate legal insignia. But no one had opened it yet, and no one could yet understand that everything about this night was about to change. For a moment after she said the word that shattered the silence, no one in the ballroom moved, as if movement itself had become something dangerous, something that could break the fragile illusion holding the night together. Ethan Carter remained frozen on the stage under the white spotlights, his hand still hovering near the microphone he had just lowered, his eyes locked on the small girl standing at the edge of the platform, as if the world had narrowed into a single impossible equation he had never been given the chance to solve. Around him, the Carter Industries executives who had been applauding seconds earlier now exchanged confused glances, their smiles fading into uncertain expressions as whispers began to rise like smoke through the crowd. Claire Donovan stood several feet behind the child, her chest rising and falling more quickly now, her composure slipping in small cracks as she realized there was no longer any way to remain invisible in a room that was beginning to see everything. The security team hesitated at the edge of the stage, uncertain whether to intervene or wait for instruction, their communication devices crackling softly as they received conflicting signals from event management. Ethan finally stepped forward, one measured step at a time, descending from the stage with controlled precision that contrasted sharply with the instability spreading through the room. Emily did not move away. She simply looked up at him, her expression calm in a way that felt too mature for her age, as if she had been carrying this moment for far longer than anyone understood. When Ethan reached the floor, the distance between them collapsed into less than 3 feet, and the entire ballroom seemed to lean inward without realizing it. His voice, when it finally came, was lower than before, stripped of its public polish. He asked a single question, careful and restrained, as though afraid of the answer and yet unable to avoid it. "Who brought you here?" The question did not land as accusation, but as confusion layered with something deeper, something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Emily's gaze did not shift. Behind her, Claire took one step forward, then stopped again as if her body no longer trusted her intentions. Before anyone could respond, a man in a dark suit stepped through the aisle carrying a sealed envelope marked with the official insignia of Carter Industries Legal Affairs. The room reacted instantly, several guests leaning forward, sensing the shift from confusion to consequence. The envelope was handed to the chief event coordinator, who hesitated before breaking the seal under the pressure of hundreds of watching eyes. Ethan did not look away from Emily even as the paper was unfolded. The coordinator's hands trembled slightly as he scanned the contents, his expression tightening with each line. The silence deepened until even the faint sound of glass clinking from the bar seemed too loud. Claire's breath caught as she saw the change in the coordinator's face, a recognition of truth forming before any words were spoken aloud. Ethan finally turned his head slightly toward the document, but his attention remained divided, anchored more strongly to the child in front of him than to whatever corporate language was being prepared to change his reality. The coordinator swallowed once, then began to speak, his voice steady but heavy, announcing that the DNA verification enclosed confirmed a biological match beyond statistical uncertainty, directly linking Ethan Carter to the child standing at the center of the room. The words did not echo, they struck and stayed. For the first time that night, Ethan's control slipped in a visible way, not through movement, but through stillness, as if every structure he had built around certainty had just been quietly removed. Emily remained where she was, unaffected by the shifting atmosphere, while Claire closed her eyes briefly as if bracing for something she had already lived through long before this moment arrived. And in that suspended silence, the ballroom no longer felt like a celebration of success, but like the beginning of a truth that could no longer be contained by wealth, status, or carefully constructed silence. The moment the words from the document were spoken aloud, the atmosphere inside the ballroom shifted again, not with noise, but with a kind of collective stillness that made every breath feel heavier than the last. Ethan Carter stood motionless, his gaze slowly lowering from the child to the official document in the hands of the coordinator, as if trying to reconcile two realities that refused to coexist. Around him, the guests no longer whispered. They watched in complete attention, their earlier excitement replaced by a quiet disbelief that spread through the room like a tide. The coordinator, still holding the sealed envelope now opened, carefully adjusted his grip as he confirmed the final line once more, his voice steady, but no longer neutral as he repeated the conclusion that the DNA results confirmed a biological match with a probability so high it eliminated reasonable doubt. Claire Donovan's shoulders tightened visibly at the sound, her composure finally breaking into something more fragile as she lowered her gaze toward the polished floor, as if avoiding the weight of every stare now turning in her direction. Emily remained still, her small hands relaxed at her sides, her expression unchanged, as though the confirmation had only given language to something she had always known without needing proof. Ethan finally turned fully toward the document, but instead of reaching for it, he paused, his silence stretching longer than expected, as if the moment required him to step outside of the version of himself that had always been in control. The lights above the ballroom continued to shine with the same controlled brightness, yet everything beneath them felt altered, as if the space itself had been redefined in real time. A senior executive from Carter Industries leaned slightly toward a colleague, but stopped speaking halfway through a sentence, realizing that no private conversation could survive what was unfolding publicly. Ethan took one slow step back, then another, not as retreat, but as recalibration, his attention splitting between the child and the life he had built up to this point. Claire finally lifted her eyes, meeting the reality she had tried to avoid, her voice barely audible as she tried to speak Ethan's name, but the sound dissolved before it reached him. Emily shifted her weight slightly, looking up at him with a calm that contrasted the chaos around her. And for the first time, Ethan noticed something beyond the shock, something in her presence that felt familiar in a way he could not yet define. The coordinator lowered the document slightly, as if unsure whether to continue, but the silence demanded completion, and so he confirmed again that the results were not preliminary or uncertain, but final and legally verified under standard medical protocol. A ripple of reaction moved through the crowd, not loud, but deeply felt, as guests began to process what this meant for a man whose image had been built on precision and control. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger but in restraint, as if holding back the weight of a response that had no clear place to go. Claire took a small step forward this time, slower, more deliberate, as if accepting that avoidance was no longer possible, while Emily remained exactly where she had been since she first spoke, anchoring the entire moment without effort or intention. The ballroom no longer felt like a celebration space, but like a turning point that no one had been prepared to witness, where every polished surface reflected not success, but the beginning of consequences that could not be contained. The silence that followed the confirmation did not break. It only shifted, becoming heavier and more personal, as if the entire ballroom had stopped being an audience and had turned into a witness box for something no one had prepared to judge. Ethan Carter stood at the center of it, no longer framed by the stage lights, but by the weight of every gaze in the room, his expression controlled, yet visibly affected by the reality that the document had made impossible to ignore. Emily remained in the same place, small and steady, her presence acting like an anchor in a space that felt increasingly unstable. Claire Donovan finally stepped forward again, this time not stopping, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor, each step slower than the last as she approached the distance between truth and consequence. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but carried through the silence because nothing else dared to compete with it. She said Ethan's name once, carefully, as if testing whether it still belonged in her mouth after everything that had happened before this moment. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, his eyes shifted between Claire and Emily, as if attempting to map a connection that had been buried beneath years of separation and silence. The coordinator lowered the document completely now, holding it only as a formality rather than authority, while the surrounding executives began to exchange uncertain glances, no longer confident in how to interpret the shift happening in front of them. One of the board members leaned toward another and whispered something about protocol, but even that conversation faded as attention returned to the center of the room, where everything important was now unfolding. Claire stopped a few feet from Ethan, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the exhaustion of holding back a truth that had finally stopped waiting. Emily looked up at Ethan again, her expression unchanged, and in that moment Ethan seemed to notice something deeper than resemblance or coincidence, something that did not belong to business logic or public image. It was familiarity that had no explanation yet demanded recognition. The room felt suspended, as if even time was waiting for him to decide what kind of man he would be in the next sentence he spoke. Ethan finally lowered his voice, not addressing the crowd but the two people in front of him, asking Claire a question that carried no performance, only consequence. His words were simple, but they fractured the remaining distance between denial and understanding. Claire hesitated before answering, her eyes briefly closing as she gathered herself, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of years that had never been spoken aloud. Around them, the ballroom no longer felt like a celebration space, but like a sealed environment where every secret had finally reached its limit. Emily shifted slightly closer to Claire, not out of fear but instinct, as if sensing the emotional tension rather than the words themselves. Ethan's posture changed subtly, his shoulders no longer as rigid, though his expression remained locked in a state of internal calculation that no longer felt entirely professional or detached. The executives watching began to realize that no corporate response could resolve what was unfolding, because this was no longer about reputation or event control, but about identity being redefined in real time under public light. Claire finally met Ethan's gaze fully, And in that silence between them, the past they had avoided seemed to surface without permission, filling the space that words had not yet reached. Emily remained still, the center of attention without ever asking for it, while Ethan stood at the edge of a decision that would reshape everything he had once believed was already settled. The tension in the room deepened further as Ethan Carter remained standing in the center of the ballroom, no longer the controlled figure who had opened the evening, but a man suspended between certainty and everything he had not yet admitted to himself. Claire Donovan held his gaze, her expression no longer defensive but quiet, as if she had finally reached the point where explanation was no longer about convincing anyone, but about releasing what had been carried alone for too long. Emily stayed close to her, her small hand lightly touching Claire's coat, steady in a way that contrasted the emotional weight surrounding them. Ethan's voice finally broke the silence again, lower now, stripped of its public tone, asking Claire when, not an accusation, but in search of structure for something that no longer fit inside the boundaries of his understanding. Claire hesitated for only a moment before answering, and in that moment the entire room seemed to lean forward without moving, every executive, investor, and guest held in the same suspended attention. She spoke carefully, explaining not with drama but with clarity that came from years of restraint, describing how distance, timing, and circumstance had shaped decisions that were never meant to reach a moment like this in front of so many eyes. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression shifting subtly as fragments of memory or possibility aligned with what he was hearing, though nothing yet resolved into certainty beyond what the document had already confirmed. Around them, the ballroom remained silent except for the faint sound of shifting weight and distant glassware being set down, as if even the environment had accepted that nothing about this night would return to its original form. Emily looked between them once, then up at Ethan again, her voice small but clear as she repeated a single word, not demanding attention, but simply placing truth into the space that adults were struggling to define. That single word softened something in Ethan's posture, not breaking his composure, but altering it in a way that suggested recognition, moving beyond logic into something more human. Claire's eyes lowered briefly, then returned to Ethan as she continued, explaining the absence of contact, the decisions made in isolation, and the silence that had stretched across years until it collapsed into this moment under lights and witnesses. Ethan took a slow breath, his attention no longer divided between the room and the stage, but anchored entirely in front of him, as if the rest of the world had begun to fade into background noise. A member of the Carter Industries board attempted to approach from the side, but stopped when Ethan lifted a hand slightly, signaling without words that nothing about this moment would be managed through procedure. The coordinator holding the document stepped back further, recognizing that authority had shifted from corporate structure to personal reality. Claire finally finished speaking, her voice steady but quieter at the end, as if releasing the last of what she had carried. Emily remained still, her presence unchanged, but now more clearly at the center of Ethan's focus as he looked at her not as an interruption to the evening, but as something that redefined its entire meaning. The ballroom, once filled with celebration and recognition, now existed as a space of suspended consequence where every observer understood that the outcome of this moment would extend far beyond the walls of the Manhattan Sky Hall. The silence that followed Claire Donovan's last words did not fade. It settled deeper into the room, as if the entire ballroom had accepted that nothing spoken after this point could ever return to being ordinary. Ethan Carter stood still, his eyes no longer scanning the crowd or the stage, but focused entirely on the small space between himself, Claire, and the child who had shifted everything without raising her voice. Emily remained close to Claire, but her gaze stayed on Ethan, steady and unafraid, as though she was observing something she had already understood long before the adults around her had found language for it. Claire finally exhaled, her shoulders easing slightly, not from relief but from exhaustion, as if the act of holding back truth for years had reached its final limit in a single night. Ethan's voice returned again, quieter now, not carrying the tone of authority or control, but something more grounded and uncertain, asking Claire if there was anything else he needed to know that had not already been placed in front of him through documents, words, or silence. Claire shook her head slowly, confirming that what had been revealed was not the beginning of a story, but the end of a hidden one that had simply waited too long to surface. Around them, the atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted completely, with executives no longer speaking at all, their attention fixed on the center of the room, where corporate hierarchy no longer seemed to matter. A few security personnel adjusted their positions instinctively, not to intervene, but to ensure space remained clear, as if they too understood that this moment was no longer about protocol. Ethan finally looked down at Emily more directly, his expression softening in a way that was barely visible but unmistakable in its change, as he asked her a simple question about her name, not as confirmation of identity, but as an attempt to bridge the gap between information and reality. Emily answered without hesitation, her voice small but steady, and the sound of it seemed to anchor something inside Ethan that had been unsteady since the document was read aloud. Claire watched this exchange carefully, her own expression tightening slightly, not in fear, but in awareness that this was the first real moment of contact between them after years of separation and absence. Ethan lowered himself slightly, bringing himself closer to Emily's level, not fully kneeling but enough to reduce the distance between authority and innocence, as the surrounding guests observed in complete silence. The coordinator, still holding the paperwork, stepped back further, as if the document had already fulfilled its purpose and no longer needed to be present in the same space as human consequence. Ethan asked Claire one final question, not about verification or legality, but about timing, about what had been lost in the years between absence and discovery. Claire hesitated before answering, her voice quieter now, acknowledging the weight of everything that had been delayed, avoided, or left unspoken. Emily reached out slightly toward Ethan without fully closing the distance, her movement subtle but enough to shift the emotional focus of the room once again. Ethan did not pull back, but he also did not rush forward, instead holding still as if allowing the moment to define itself without interference. The ballroom, once designed for celebration and recognition, now felt like a suspended space where every observer understood they were witnessing a transition that could not be reversed. Outside the glass walls, the city lights of Manhattan continued unchanged, but inside, everything that had once defined Ethan Carter's identity as a controlled and untouchable figure was quietly being rewritten in real time by a child's presence and a truth that no longer needed permission to exist. The ballroom remained completely still, not because the moment had ended, but because it had not yet resolved into anything the room could safely react to. Ethan Carter stood facing Emily at a distance that no longer felt formal, his expression no longer shaped by the expectations of the executives, the cameras, or the reputation that had followed him into every space of his career. Claire Donovan remained slightly behind Emily, her posture steady now but quieter, as if she had finally released the burden of carrying a truth alone. Emily looked up at Ethan with the same calm presence she had held since she first spoke, her small frame contrasting with the scale of the room around her, yet somehow defining it more than any display of wealth or recognition ever had. Ethan slowly lowered himself further until he was fully at her level, his movements deliberate and unhurried, as though giving himself permission to exist in a moment that was no longer governed by public perception. For a long time, he did not speak, and the silence that followed was no longer tense but reflective, as if the weight of everything that had been revealed was settling into its final form. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and direct, no longer addressing the room, but speaking only to Emily and Claire, acknowledging what had been confirmed without needing repetition or validation. Claire listened without interruption, her eyes occasionally shifting between Ethan and Emily, recognizing that the conversation was no longer about explanation but about what came after understanding. Around them, the ballroom began to subtly shift, not in movement but in attention, as guests realized that the center of gravity had changed and would not return to its original position. Some of the executives stepped back slightly, instinctively giving space to a moment that no longer belonged to corporate structure or scheduled programming. The coordinator holding the document lowered it completely, no longer treating it as a procedural artifact, but as something that had already served its purpose in a larger human consequence. Ethan's gaze remained on Emily as he asked if she was okay, not in the context of security or logistics, but in a way that suggested awareness of the emotional weight she had carried into this room without hesitation. Emily nodded once, a simple and certain response that seemed to steady something inside him that had been suspended since the beginning of the evening. Claire exhaled softly, her shoulders easing again, as if the tension that had defined years of uncertainty was finally beginning to release in stages rather than all at once. Ethan then looked toward Claire, not with accusation or distance, but with a clarity that suggested the need to understand what kind of future, if any, could exist after a truth like this had entered the present. Claire met his gaze fully this time, no longer avoiding or deflecting, and in that exchange there was no attempt to rewrite the past, only an acknowledgement that it could no longer remain separate from what was unfolding now. Emily shifted slightly closer to Ethan without urgency, her presence calm and natural, as if proximity was no longer something to be questioned but something that belonged. The surrounding guests remained silent, many no longer focused on recording or observing, but simply absorbing the reality that the evening had transformed into something irreversible. Ethan finally straightened slightly, not fully returning to his former posture, but rising enough to signal a transition, as if the moment was no longer about revelation but about what would be done with it. Claire gently guided Emily closer to him, not forcing connection but allowing space for it to happen naturally. Ethan extended his hand slowly, not as an announcement to the room, but as an offering to the child who had changed the trajectory of everything without raising her voice. Emily placed her hand in his without hesitation, and in that simple contact the ballroom's final layer of silence shifted, not breaking, but transforming into something that no longer felt like shock, but like the beginning of acceptance. Outside the glass walls, the city continued in motion, but inside, Ethan Carter no longer stood as only a CEO under lights and recognition, but as a man confronting a truth that had quietly rewritten every definition of success he once believed was permanent. The moment Emily's small hand rested in Ethan Carter's, the entire atmosphere inside the ballroom shifted again, not with noise, but with a quiet recalibration that made every observer realize they were no longer watching an announcement, but the formation of something far more permanent. Ethan did not tighten his grip or pull away. Instead, he remained still for a brief second, as if registering a connection that had bypassed logic and entered something deeper and unspoken. Claire Donovan watched this carefully, her expression softening in a way that suggested relief mixed with years of distance finally collapsing into the present. Emily looked up at Ethan without hesitation, her presence calm, as if the simple act of holding his hand confirmed something she had always carried within her understanding. Around them, the executives and guests remained silent, no longer reacting with shock, but with a subdued awareness that the moment had moved beyond surprise into acceptance. Ethan slowly straightened, still holding Emily's hand, and for the first time that evening, he turned slightly not toward the audience but toward Claire, acknowledging her presence without the barriers that had defined their earlier exchange. Claire stepped closer, her movements measured and careful, as if afraid that any sudden action might disturb the fragile stability forming between them. Ethan spoke again, his voice steady but no longer distant, asking Claire what needed to happen next, not in terms of business or procedure, but in terms of responsibility and clarity. Claire paused, then answered honestly, explaining that nothing about the situation could be resolved in a single moment, and that understanding would require time, not control. Emily shifted slightly, adjusting her position so she stood closer to both of them, forming a small triangle that contrasted with the vastness of the ballroom surrounding them. Ethan looked down at her again, and this time his expression carried something quieter than shock, something closer to recognition turning into presence. The coordinator, still holding formal materials, remained at a distance, no longer stepping forward, as if aware that documentation no longer held authority in this space. The executives behind them began to disperse their rigid posture, some lowering their phones, others simply watching without movement, as the energy of the room transformed from spectacle into reflection. Ethan finally took a slow breath, not as a reaction but as a grounding motion, as if allowing himself to remain fully present in a reality that could no longer be postponed or delegated. Claire's voice softened as she asked if they could step away from the stage area, suggesting a quieter space within the venue where they could speak without the weight of observation. Ethan nodded once, not releasing Emily's hand, and together they began to move slowly away from the center of the ballroom, leaving behind the raised platform, the lights, and the audience that had once defined the evening. As they walked, the surrounding guests parted instinctively, creating space without instruction, recognizing that what they were witnessing was no longer part of the scheduled ceremony. Emily walked between them with steady steps, her small presence guiding the direction of movement more than any spoken decision. Claire followed slightly behind, watching Ethan and Emily with an expression that carried both relief and uncertainty about what this new alignment would become. Ethan did not look back at the stage, nor at the crowd, as if the identity he had carried into the evening was already being replaced by something quieter and less performative. The ballroom behind them remained illuminated, but the center of attention had already shifted away, leaving the space behind them as a fading reflection of what the night had once been. Outside the glass walls, Manhattan continued its uninterrupted rhythm, but inside, Ethan Carter moved forward not as a figure of authority or recognition, but as someone beginning to navigate a truth that could no longer be separated from his future. The transition from the main ballroom into the quieter executive lounge of the Manhattan Sky Hall felt less like a change of location and more like a gradual escape from a collapsing illusion. As Ethan Carter led the way with Emily still holding his hand and Claire Donovan following a few steps behind, the sound of the awards ceremony fading into a distant echo that no longer felt relevant to what had just occurred. The hallway lights were softer here, warmer in tone, but they did little to reduce the emotional weight that had followed them out of the crowd, as if the truth itself had attached itself to their movement and refused to remain behind. Ethan finally released a slow breath as they entered the lounge, a private space reserved for executives and select guests, where floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the Manhattan skyline stretching endlessly under a quiet night sky. Emily released his hand only after they stopped, standing near a large window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass alongside Ethan and Claire, forming a composition that felt both unfamiliar and strangely inevitable. Claire stepped closer to the seating area but did not sit immediately, her attention still divided between Ethan and Emily, as if still adjusting to the fact that proximity no longer carried the tension it once did. Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice lower and more controlled than before, asking Claire what she had told Emily over the years, not as a challenge, but as a search for continuity in a story that had been fragmented by distance and time. Claire hesitated, then responded with careful honesty, explaining that she had never built a version of truth for Emily that relied on certainty, only on protection and timing, choosing what to reveal based on what she believed the world would allow without causing harm. Emily listened quietly, seated now on the edge of a soft chair, her legs still not reaching the floor, her attention moving between the two adults without confusion, as if she understood more than she expressed. Ethan walked slowly toward the window, placing one hand on the glass as he looked out over the city lights, his reflection merging with the skyline in a way that made him appear both present and distant at the same time. He asked Claire whether she had ever tried to reach him during those years, and the question carried no accusation, only an attempt to understand the timeline that had led to this moment. Claire answered that attempts had been made indirectly at first, then stopped, not because of anger, but because circumstances and distance had made continuation impossible without forcing consequences that felt too large to control. Ethan absorbed this without interruption, his expression tightening slightly not in anger, but in realization that absence often builds its own architecture of misunderstanding. Behind him, Emily swung her legs gently, her gaze drifting toward the skyline, as if the city itself was part of a story she was only now beginning to see differently. Claire finally sat down, her posture easing for the first time since the ballroom, though her eyes remained alert, aware that nothing about this conversation was final despite its calm tone. Ethan turned back toward them, his voice quieter now, asking what Emily needed, not in abstract terms, but in immediate reality, as if trying to understand how to begin without disrupting what already existed. Claire looked at Emily before answering, allowing her presence to guide the response, stating that stability mattered more than explanation at this stage, and that any future decisions would need to respect the emotional foundation already formed. Emily looked up at Ethan again, her expression steady, and for a moment the space between them felt less like uncertainty and more like the beginning of recognition becoming structure. Ethan slowly nodded, not in agreement alone, but in acceptance that what had entered his life could no longer be treated as an interruption, but had already become part of its ongoing reality. Outside the window, Manhattan continued its constant motion of light and distance, but inside the quiet lounge, the conversation no longer belonged to the night of an event, but to something that would extend far beyond it. The silence inside the executive lounge had settled into something more structured now, no longer the shock of revelation, but the quieter weight of consequence as Ethan Carter remained seated across from Claire Donovan and Emily, the city lights of Manhattan stretching behind them like an endless reminder that the outside world had continued moving while their reality had been permanently altered. Ethan's posture was still composed, but there was a noticeable difference in how he held himself now. Less like a man controlling a situation and more like someone adjusting to a version of life that could no longer be reversed or ignored. Emily sat in the same chair near the window, her attention drifting between Ethan and Claire, occasionally glancing at the skyline, as if trying to understand where she now fit within a story that had suddenly expanded beyond what she had known. Claire finally spoke again, her voice measured and calm, explaining that the decision to remain distant had never been about secrecy alone, but about timing, protection, and the belief that stability mattered more than disruption during Emily's early years. Ethan listened without interruption, his eyes focused on Claire, but softening slightly as he processed not only what was said, but what had been left unspoken for years. He asked a follow-up question quietly, not demanding clarity, but seeking continuity, wanting to understand how much of Emily's life had been shaped without him and whether any of it had carried his absence as a burden or simply as background. Claire hesitated before answering, her expression shifting briefly toward Emily before she responded, stating that Emily had been raised with consistency, care, and honesty appropriate to her age, without creating expectations that could not be supported by certainty. Emily, hearing her name, turned slightly in her seat, her small voice breaking into the conversation with a simple observation about the city lights outside, grounding the moment in something ordinary amid the extraordinary circumstances surrounding them. Ethan allowed a faint, almost imperceptible expression of calm to surface, as if that small remark reminded him that despite everything, she was still a child experiencing the world in her own way, not yet defined by the complexity of adult history. He leaned back slightly, looking again through the glass at Manhattan, and for the first time since the ballroom, his silence did not feel like control, but like reflection. Claire adjusted her position in the chair, her hands resting together now, no longer tense, but still attentive to every shift in Ethan's expression, aware that nothing about this conversation could be resolved quickly or simplistically. Ethan eventually spoke again, this time addressing both Claire and Emily indirectly, stating that whatever came next would need to prioritize stability and clarity rather than urgency or external pressure, acknowledging that whatever identity had formed between them could not be rushed into structure without understanding its foundation. Emily listened without reacting strongly, but her attention remained steady, as if she understood the importance of tone, even if not all the meaning. The room remained quiet except for the distant city hum filtering through the glass, and in that quiet Ethan seemed to make a subtle internal shift, no longer reacting to the situation as an interruption to his life, but as something that had become part of it in a permanent way. Claire finally nodded, not in agreement alone, but in recognition that the conversation had moved from revelation into responsibility. Ethan's gaze returned briefly to Emily, and there was no longer hesitation in it, only presence, as if the distance that had defined the beginning of the night had begun to dissolve into something more grounded and real. Outside, the city continued its relentless rhythm of light and motion, but inside the executive lounge, the moment had transitioned fully into a new reality where nothing about the future could be approached in the same way it had been before. The quiet inside the executive lounge deepened as the night outside the glass walls of Manhattan continued to move without pause, But inside the space, everything had slowed into a more deliberate rhythm as Ethan Carter, Claire Donovan, and Emily remained seated in a formation that no longer felt temporary, but increasingly structured by presence rather than explanation. Ethan had not spoken for several moments, his attention alternating between the city skyline and Emily, as if he was still learning how to hold two realities at once, one built from years of control and distance, and the other emerging now through something far more immediate and human. Claire finally broke the silence with a measured tone, not to reopen the past, but to address what would come next, asking Ethan if he intended to keep the situation private or allow it to remain within corporate awareness given the scale of public exposure earlier in the ballroom. Ethan did not answer immediately, his expression tightening slightly as he considered not only reputation but also the impact on Emily, who sat quietly listening without fully understanding the weight of what was being discussed, but sensing its importance nonetheless. After a brief pause, Ethan responded that privacy would need to be prioritized, not as a strategy for control, but as a necessity for stability, especially for Emily's adjustment to a situation that had already been disrupted in a public environment. Claire nodded slowly, acknowledging the concern, and added that stability would also require consistency in communication moving forward, suggesting that abrupt decisions or fragmented contact would only increase uncertainty for Emily. Ethan's gaze shifted toward Emily again at that point, and his expression softened slightly as he acknowledged that truth without resistance, recognizing that structure would matter more than anything else in what followed. Emily shifted in her seat, looking between both adults before speaking in a small but steady voice, asking whether she would still be able to see the city lights from a place that felt less loud than the ballroom, a question that carried simplicity but revealed the way she was already processing change in her own terms. Ethan offered a slight nod and assured her that nothing about her immediate environment needed to feel overwhelming, his tone calm and careful, as if choosing each word with intention rather than instinct. Claire watched this exchange quietly, her posture easing further as she observed that the tension that had defined the earlier moments was now transforming into something more structured and less volatile. A faint knock at the door interrupted them briefly, and a member of Ethan's security team entered only to confirm that the press presence outside the venue had increased, with media attempting to gather information about what had occurred during the awards ceremony. Ethan acknowledged the update without reaction, then instructed that no statements were to be made, reinforcing his earlier decision to contain the situation until clarity was fully established. The security staff member left quietly, and the room returned to silence, though it no longer carried the same weight of uncertainty as before. Claire adjusted her position slightly and suggested that the next step should involve a private conversation away from the venue entirely, somewhere controlled and removed from external pressure, allowing Emily to adjust without exposure. Ethan agreed after a moment of consideration, stating that arrangements could be made immediately, though his focus remained partially on Emily, as if ensuring her comfort was now the primary reference point for any decision. Emily listened without resistance, her small hands resting in her lap, occasionally glancing toward Ethan as if confirming that his presence remained steady. The three of them sat for a brief moment without speaking again, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the structure of their reality had shifted enough that silence itself felt like part of the transition. Outside, the city continued its uninterrupted motion, but inside the executive lounge, Ethan Carter no longer appeared as a figure responding to disruption, but as someone beginning to navigate a responsibility that had quietly rewritten the boundaries of his future. The decision to leave the executive lounge came without urgency, but with quiet agreement, as Ethan Carter, Claire Donovan, and Emily moved together through the private corridor of the Manhattan Sky Hall, away from the glass walls that had once framed the city like a distant backdrop, and into a more controlled passage where security presence had already been reinforced in anticipation of external attention. Ethan walked slightly ahead, not in a way that separated him from them, but in a way that naturally created space for guidance, his posture steady again, though no longer carrying the same emotional distance that had defined him earlier in the evening. Claire followed closely with Emily beside her, maintaining a calm pace as the sound of distant movement from the main ballroom faded into the background. As they approached the service exit, A member of the security team quietly confirmed that media presence outside the building had increased significantly, with multiple outlets attempting to confirm details of what had occurred inside the award ceremony. Ethan acknowledged the update with a brief nod and instructed that all exits remain controlled and that no access be granted to external press, his tone now fully grounded in containment and protection rather than reaction or surprise. Emily held onto Claire's hand as they reached the exit door, pausing for a brief moment as the transition from interior silence to the city night became visible through the narrow glass panel. Ethan noticed her pause and slowed his pace, turning slightly as if to ensure she was ready before proceeding. Claire leaned down gently and spoke to Emily in a soft voice, explaining that they were simply moving to a quieter place where things would feel less overwhelming. And Emily responded with a small nod that suggested understanding even if not full comprehension. When the door opened, the cool air of the New York night replaced the controlled warmth of the venue, and the distant sound of traffic, sirens, and city movement created a new environment that felt less confined but more expansive. A black vehicle was already waiting at the curb, its doors open under the guidance of security personnel who ensured a clear path forward. Ethan stepped slightly to the side to allow Claire and Emily to enter first, a gesture that marked a subtle shift in his behavior from command to consideration. Claire guided Emily into the vehicle carefully, ensuring she was comfortable before taking her own seat, while Ethan paused briefly outside, scanning the surroundings out of instinct rather than concern. Once inside, the interior of the vehicle offered a different kind of silence, insulated from the city, but no longer carrying the tension of the ballroom. Ethan sat across from them, his attention immediately returning to Emily, who now looked out the tinted window at the passing lights of Manhattan. Claire broke the silence gently, suggesting that the next step should involve a temporary private residence away from media presence, where Emily could adjust without external pressure or disruption. Ethan agreed without hesitation, instructing the driver to proceed to one of his secured residential properties, though his tone remained measured, focused more on stability than ownership or control. As the vehicle merged into traffic, the city lights blurred into continuous motion outside the windows, creating a shifting backdrop that contrasted with the stillness inside. Emily eventually turned her attention inward, asking quietly if she would still be able to see the sky clearly from the new place, her question simple but reflective of her need for continuity. Ethan answered gently that she would, and that nothing about the night would remove the things that mattered most to her sense of comfort. Claire watched this exchange carefully, noticing that Ethan's responses were no longer shaped by distance or formality, but by attentiveness that suggested a growing awareness of responsibility extending beyond the immediate situation. The vehicle continued forward through Manhattan streets, passing illuminated buildings and intersections filled with movement, while inside, the three of them sat in a silence that no longer felt fragmented but gradually forming into something more structured. Ethan leaned slightly back in his seat, his gaze shifting between the passing city and Emily, recognizing that the trajectory of his life had already moved beyond the boundaries of the evening that had begun it. Nothing was resolved, yet nothing remained unchanged, and in that quiet passage through the city, the reality of what had begun in a ballroom of lights and recognition was now transitioning into something that would require presence, time, and permanence. The vehicle moved steadily through the nighttime streets of Manhattan, passing intersections of white headlights and red taillights that stretched like flowing signals of a city that never paused. While inside the cabin, Ethan Carter, Claire Donovan, and Emily remained seated in a silence that had evolved from shock into something more structured and reflective. Emily leaned slightly toward the window, her eyes following the movement of buildings and lights, no longer overwhelmed but quietly observant, as if beginning to process the transition from one environment to another. Claire sat beside her, maintaining a calm presence, occasionally adjusting her posture to ensure Emily remained comfortable, while Ethan sat opposite them, his attention divided between the city outside and the reality unfolding inside the vehicle. No one spoke for several minutes, and the silence no longer felt like uncertainty but like space for adjustment, allowing each of them to settle into the new configuration of their situation. Eventually, the vehicle turned onto a quieter avenue, where residential lighting replaced the density of commercial buildings, signaling their approach to the secured property Ethan had instructed earlier. A few moments later, the car slowed and came to a controlled stop in front of a modern high-rise residence with subtle exterior lighting and private access security already in place. The driver exited first, followed by security personnel who ensured the surroundings were clear before opening the rear door. Ethan stepped out first this time, scanning the area briefly before turning to assist Claire and Emily as they exited. The entrance lobby was quiet, with soft lighting and minimal presence, designed for privacy rather than display, and the group moved through it without interruption. As they entered the private elevator, the doors closed gently, sealing out the city noise and replacing it with a controlled stillness that followed them upward. Emily stood closer to Claire during the ascent, but her gaze occasionally shifted toward Ethan, who remained composed but noticeably more present than he had been earlier in the night. Claire broke the silence briefly, asking whether arrangements for the following day should include external coordination or remain entirely private, and Ethan responded that privacy would remain the priority until clarity and stability were fully established for Emily's environment. The elevator reached the upper floor, and the doors opened into a softly lit interior space overlooking the city skyline, where floor-to-ceiling windows revealed Manhattan at a distance, now quieter and more diffuse than before. Emily stepped out first, moving slowly toward the window, her attention immediately drawn to the view, as if reconnecting with something familiar in a new setting. Claire followed, taking a moment to assess the space before turning her attention back to Emily to ensure she felt secure. Ethan entered last, pausing briefly at the threshold before stepping fully inside, allowing the doors to close behind him with a soft mechanical sound that marked the end of movement and the beginning of stillness. The room remained quiet, with only the distant city visible beyond the glass, and for a moment none of them spoke, as if collectively acknowledging that the events of the night had fully transitioned into a new phase. Emily finally turned from the window and asked quietly if this was where she would stay for now, her voice calm, but seeking confirmation. Ethan answered gently that it was temporary but safe, and that she would not be placed in unfamiliar environments without stability or understanding. Claire added softly that adjustments would be made gradually, ensuring that nothing changed too quickly or without preparation. Emily nodded slightly, accepting the explanation, then returned her attention to the skyline, now appearing more at ease than before. Ethan remained standing for a moment longer, observing both Claire and Emily, recognizing that the structure of their reality had shifted beyond the point of return to its former state. The evening that had begun under bright chandeliers and public recognition had now resolved into quiet continuity within a private space overlooking the city, where identity, responsibility, and connection were no longer abstract ideas but immediate conditions shaping every decision moving forward.